My name is Bryce Wakefield. I'm Asia Program Associate here at the Woodrow Wilson Centre. Today we're going to talk about game change in the Asia Pacific, the South China Sea and TPP, with our speaker, Takashi Terada. He's the Wilson Centre, the current Wilson Centre Japan Scholar. The Japan Scholarship is currently a 2 to 4 month program for visiting Japanese scholars who spend time at the center, work on their projects, and then present them here. Hopefully they publish something from their time at the center. Takashi is also a professor of international relations at the Organization for Asian Studies at Waseda University. That is still, I think, his current title. After his stay here at the Wilson Center, he'll be moving off to Doshisha University in Kyoto, where he'll be taking up a new role as professor of international relations. He was an assistant professor at the National University of Singapore. He has written extensively in Japanese and English on integration and competition within the Asian region, and he has a PhD from Australian National University. Today's event is sponsored by two other programs here at the Wilson Centre, the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, and the program on America and the global economy, and we thank them for their support. Without further ado, I'll pass things over to Takashi to get us started.
Thank you very much, Bryce. Very good afternoon. Thank you very much for also gathering this evening. I just finished creating the PowerPoint 5-10 minutes ago because this is very last day for my stay at the Wilson Center, and I'm going back to my country tomorrow morning. So therefore I needed to clean and clear my office, and if it took some time rather than focusing on the making the PowerPoint. Anyway, before starting my talk, I just like to say thank you very much, the Bob and also Bryce, first for accepting me at the Japan Scholar at the center, also providing me a lot of help and promoting my own research here. And also I'd like to thank Mr. Hayashi, just sitting in the rear side, for providing me again the very good research assistantship. He's a career diplomat, so using career diplomat as a research assistant is very tough, and because going back to my country, his ranking is much important than the professorship in universities. But he provided me a lot of information and data, and again, I try to use some of it in my presentation today. So about 3 months ago, I in the same room here, I made a presentation on my proposal of research at the center, just 5 minutes. Topic is very different from what I described here. I was more interested in the financial regional architecture with a particular focus on Japan and China's role. And of course, the purpose coming here was to check the American or World Bank or IMF's views on the growing Asian regional financial architecture, and particularly, the China-Japan's competitions. But after coming down here, more American interests lie in the trade issues, epitomized by the development TPP, which I presented here 2 months ago together with colleagues. And also the most regional security issues, especially focusing on South China Sea. And this development was, of course, epitomized by the word Asian pivot. So I tried to change the topic without getting approval from my boss. just took the liberty of doing something which might be more interesting and useful for American people. So today's seminar, it's simply from my own viewpoint to have so-called reality check with the people working in Washington, D.C. Well, staying here for 3 months, first time for me, was tremendous opportunities and experiences, not only for research-oriented life, but also the social life as well. It's meeting a lot of people whom probably I hardly see in Tokyo. So again, providing me this opportunity. Once again, thanks so much. Okay. Well, game change is probably the, again, well-known words and in Washington, D.C. But again, still, the lot of puzzles evolving around the terminologies, even definitions. So therefore, I dared just provide my own thoughts on the game change, particularly focusing on the Asia-Pacific region. This is my area of specialty, with a focus on the two issues which I just mentioned. So it seems to me the areas which game change has been involved has two folds, economic and also security. And both also has a game 1, game 2. Game 1 was, of course, existing or previous games. And game 2 was something which the newcomer or challenger tried to introduce. So game 1 was, well, again, dominated by China. It was so active in diplomacy in this way, just through the signing of TSC, Treaty of Amity Cooperation of ASEAN, which is the one of the 3 conditions for any nations to participate in East Asian Summit, or EAS, started by Malaysia at the time in 2005. And all nations who want to come to attend the EAS needs to sign the TSC. But again, like Japan, Australia, both which are quite close allied nations, but United States, US was very hesitant to sign the TSC because it included the so-called non-intervention principle. So in the previous government, and hardly paid attention to the signing of the TSC. But China was the very first nation after Papua New Guinea to sign the TSC in 2002. FTA, Free Trade Agreement, again, started by China with ASEAN as a single trading partner. Before that, we never saw the ASEAN as a FTA partner, as a single unit. But after that, as you know, the more regional countries, including Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, India, also followed China's move. So now we have 5 ASEAN plus 1 FTAs currently set up, and which was also set to be a basis for creating ASEAN plus 6 FTA. And also CMI, Chiang Initiative. Recently, it's now new M is added, Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization. Chiang Mai Initiative, CMI, started in 2000. Was sort of the collection of the bilateral SOP agreements. But of course, it's bilateral rather than regional. So therefore, it's not necessarily threatening arrangement to the United States, which blocked the Japan's proposal in 1997 of creating the Asian Monetary Fund in the midst of the Asian financial crisis. But recently, rather than bilateral, more multilateral approaches to the financial cooperation has been carried out, particularly after Lehman shock. And now the Chiang Mai Initiative multilateralization was nearly formed with the surveillance mechanism office in Singapore, just established last year. So China has been a quite active player in these developments of the regionalism in East Asia. So therefore, by looking at these elements, someone called China's diplomacy as charm offensive, very active, but always benign, smiling, and this kind of stuff. But on the other hand, China, particularly recently, as far as I know, after 2008, became quite aggressive or ambitious in terms of the treatment of the South China Sea, particularly maritime disputes. So I think that these are probably the foundation for the United States to consider, okay, we should do something to challenge or to change. So therefore, game two, I call game two, challenged by the U.S., who has been concerned about the impact of China's rise on security and economy in East Asia, and keen in promoting regional multilateralism. This word, multilateral, it's adjective anyway in this case. It's a quite interesting word. I just wrote C2010 QDR. In the previous 3 QDR, putting together, there are only 3 times using the word multilateral. But only 2010 version has 17 times. It seems to me it's a big difference compared with the previous, current one and 3 previous ones. So I think this game change, it seems to me, evolve around the America's engagement in multilateral institutions in East Asia. I know there are probably a number of ways of gauging or judging or assessing the America's engagement in game change, but my focus is a bit narrowingly defined, with a pure focus upon the U.S. engagement in multilateralism. Okay, let me start with the game change in economic regionalism. Again, well, game is, of course, it's a metaphor, but I just borrowed some of the actual games in terms of the promoting definitions. Again, multilateral institutions, starting with, and going down with norms, prayers, and issues. And game two, this right side. So multilateral institution initially dominated by China was East Asia on economic terms. But I have to say that East Asian regional integration, officially speaking, has not begun yet. Only study group levels, no negotiations taking place at all at official levels. But Asia Pacific, this is the area of which the United States is being engaged. TPP and FTAP. FTAP is a free trade area agreement in Asia Pacific. It's coined by the business group, ABAC, Apex Business Advisory Group, in 2004. But no one cared. I remember that Mr. Koizumi, then Prime Minister of Japan, was asked, what do you think of the FTAP? He said, no, we are more interested in promoting bilateral FTAs with Asian countries. So just to cold shoulders, he displayed. But when in 2006, an APEC meeting held in Hanoi, then U.S. President Mr. Bush said, we should promote this idea. And then first time in history of APEC, this FTAP, 5 alphabets, was incorporated in official APEC document. And actually, it's a leader declaration. And since then, APEC document started touching on this word, FTAP. But again, many people believe, 21 members to create the single economic market. That's a pipe dream. So therefore, still, the FTAP ideas have been going on, but no serious considerations was not necessarily given to this idea until when Mr. Bush, again, announced America's participation in TPP in 2008. And this catalyzed a proliferation of the members interested in joining TPP. So currently, as you know, the 9 countries have been engaged in offshore negotiations. So what is the difference between East Asian approach with a focus on bilateral FTAs and Asia Pacific with the TPP? Again, put it simply, prior to simply East Asia is East Asia only. United States has not been any offshore approaches to the regional integration in East Asia. Again, there's a rumor that the ASEAN US FTA might be launched. Again, this is something benefit which I got in Washington D.C. Not only Asian officials here, but also I was given the chance to talk to the American officials as well, and some of them actually touched on the possibility of the ASEAN EU FTA under the Mr. Obama's the Asian pivot. But nevertheless, at this time, at this moment, U.S. is not engaged in any type of regional integration in East Asia, only Asia-Pacific or TPP. But TPP's agendas in the bottom line, WTO plus issues, IPR, intellectual property rights, and also labor issues. This is very significant because, as I touch on later, but China, particularly some people in the Chinese think tank, like academic social sciences, found this labor issue as something which China probably never admits. For example, there's no detailed discussion of labor issues in the TPP. As far as I know, it's mentioned, the International Labor Organization, ILO, the standards should be maintained or abided by member countries. But of course, it includes the freedom of setting up the labor unions, for example. But as far as I know, the Chinese government never allowed the labor union to be created in the societies. And someone in China said, we will never have it. So even picking up these issues, and TPP can be considered to be a trading arrangement which China find it very difficult to join. But East Asian FTA is mainly its border issues, tariffs, and also not tariff eliminations, tariff reductions. So in this case, some people in the U.S. believe the FTAs in East Asia, particularly promoted by China, is low quality. So let me touch on the security ones. Again, similar categorizations. Multilateral institutions, norms, prayers, and issues. Game 1, dominated by China, focused on the ARF, or East Asian Summit. But the point is, again, norms, not legally based. Well, this was actually controlled by so-called ASEAN whites. Therefore, some people say ASEAN's talk shop was highlighted by ARF or sometimes East Asian Summit. Again, prayers, EAS had 3 additional countries to the ASEAN plus 3, which are India, New Zealand, and Australia. But nevertheless, still Asian-dominated institutions. And issues, well, what we call non-traditional security issues, like natural disasters, environment issues. And but after the Mr. Obama's declarations, U.S. engagement in East Asia summit, it was announced by him in Tokyo, actually, November 2009. And then a few months later, 3 months later, official announcement was made by Hillary Clinton in Honolulu, January 2010. Again, EAS has been changing or transformed, particularly after the Americans' engagement in it. First, legal and rule-based approaches has been attempted to be introduced, particularly freedom of navigation and the rule of conduct. These were 2 words which we can easily find in a U.S. document or American leaders' statements, which means we hardly found it in Asian leaders' statements or documents, particularly in China. So therefore issues, just bottom line, so-called hard issues like territorial disputes have been introduced in agenda at the East Asian Summit. Again, first time in the history of East Asian Summit since 2005, last year in Indonesia. So again, the change, economic games and also security games both have sort of the America's engagement, which attempt to change some of element, norms, and also issues. And it seems to me the common or shared element in both security and economic game is so-called American engagement in a coalition building with like-minded countries. That means, U.S. try not to push its favorite agenda, its norms by itself. it tried to push them together with like-minded countries. I think this is a quite significant element in causing the game changes, so that norms and functions, even issues, could be more smoothly acceptable in regional institutions in East Asia. So multilateralism is a venue in which U.S. tries to use it in attempt to engage in the coalition building efforts. ARF, ADMM plus 8. ADMM means ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting. But recently, just only one time in 2010, and it will be held every 3 years. So plus 8 is, again, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, India, and Russia and the United States. And Shangri-La Dialogue, it's a so-called think tank-oriented institution, meeting every year held in Singapore, Shangri-La Hotel. Very, very good hotel, although I never stayed over there. And also APEC and the EAS. So, the Americans' engagement in the multilateral institution in East Asia and also Asia-Pacific has been growing over the last few years. And then, specifically economic games, in terms of the efforts to promote coalition building, how the TPP membership can be expanded to create a so-called critical mass. So therefore, as I touch on later, Japan's interest in joining TPP, again, I know there are several different opinions in this country, but generally, Japan's interest was welcome, especially by the government or leaders in the United States. Security games, but this is a bit complex because multilateral institutions can be used to carry the American message directly to China together with other countries. For example, East Asian Summit last year, except for Cambodia and Myanmar, all nations, all participants in East Asian Summit members, leaders, touched on the maritime security issues. Never happened before. So I think America was successful in coalition building in this case. And no wonder, the Chinese leader was visiting, recently the Cambodia to get to the more close, relationships. But anyway, security games, in terms of the coalition building, involved the military exercises. Also, defense and military talks, which also I come back later, particularly with a focus on Japan. This is my country, therefore I have a bit better knowledge on that compared with for example, India or Vietnam. Also, both of which have been heavily engaged in the military and defense talks and exercises. So let me focus on TPP as a game changer. As I touched on before, China, some people in China view the U.S. commitment to TPP as motivated by checking China's growing influence in regional integration. So therefore, when Japan showed an interest in joining it, China was a bit upset. And as I touch on later, tried to persuade Japan to come closer to the China's area of integration. And why Japan was considered to be significant to the U.S., particularly in terms of the membership expansion? I think the one big reason was related to its size. Again, I wrote here, in terms of the GDP, twice the size of the other 8 countries putting together. So therefore, in terms of the market size, and also making other countries be more attracted to TPP, big nations' participation was considered to be very significant. But on the other hand, from Japanese viewpoint, U.S. enthusiasm on the TPP has encouraged Japan to seriously consider participating and engaging in regional integration in Asia-Pacific, which I touched on in this room 2 months ago, with a more focus upon the Japanese domestic politics or discussions on TPP. And furthermore, but Japan's interest in stimulated also growing region-wide attention to TPP and helped cause Mexico and Canada to follow Japan's lead. And there was also mentioned by Philippines, which are said to be interested in joining TPP. I was back to Japan 2 weeks ago to attend the so-called Japan-ASEAN dialogue. It's a more think tank level discussions, ASEAN ICs and the Japanese Institutional Foreign Affairs. And of course, the conference itself was quite interesting, but more significantly, of the conference, we had more informal discussions with ASEAN senior officials and also academics. And one of the Thai well-known journalists told me that, Philippines was bizarre. And I said, why? Because Philippines is not free trade-oriented country, not ready for joining the high-quality type of TPP. But Philippines showed an interest to joining it. And if it's confused as ASEAN member countries. Of course, many people can guess why Philippines was interested in joining TPP. It's probably related to the more security issues, South China Sea. Again, this defense and security agenda was also discussed in a Japanese debate on TPP, particularly strengthening links with the United States, as was the case in the KORAS, Korea-US FTAs. So if Philippines decided to join it, all ASEAN claimants on South China Sea would join TPP. Brunei, Malaysia, Vietnam. Only non-claimant was Singapore. But also Singapore has been recently more engaged in military exercises with the United States and other fellow allied nations. Despite it never mentioned South China Sea is our territory. And Japan's interest, also the more wide attention was given to the TPP by regional countries. The most significant element was China's reaction. As a result, China became, I said, two at least points could be highlighted. More active in urging Japan to conclude a trilateral FTA with South Korea by accepting to promote a trilateral investment treaty, but Japan long asked China to join. Let me explain a little bit, because this agenda is coming quite soon. In April, probably the trilateral investment treaty by China, Japan, Korea will be announced, if any political turmoil will not take place in Japan or other countries. And again, China was very reluctant to sign the investment treaty because it would touch the services and intellectual property rights, those kind of issues, getting into the more domestic rules. But Chinese and Korean businesses providing a lot of FDIs, direct investments, and they actually carried their complaints to the governments on the need of so-called investment treaty, which constrained the Chinese and governments and businesses by rules. But China was more interested in trilateral FTAs, just tariff reductions matters. So these two ideas simply went in parallel with each other, never making a compromise. But after the TPP came into the front, and Japan showed an interest, China started moving. So therefore, in May, somewhere in China, maybe Beijing, this year's trilateral summit, the China-Japan-Korea summit, would announce the commencement of the negotiations on trilateral FTAs, which China long desired. This is one. Second, China became more flexible in terms of regional integration framework, moving away from its almost exclusive pursuit of an ASEAN plus 3 towards a greater interest in ASEAN plus 6. Again, China was set to pursue or develop the ASEAN plus 3 framework, but Japan's interest was more plus 6 with New Zealand, Australia, and India. But China actually said, okay, we don't care about the differences. So therefore, Chinese and Japanese officials started calling ASEAN plus plus to make the obscure the difference of the membership. Even Japanese officials started calling it. And it was reported by Japanese media that promoting the East Asia integration by setting up the 3-4 key study groups to create the roadmap towards the East Asia integration was jointly proposed by Japan to China, not individually. So it's, as far as I know, this very first time Japan and China jointly engaged for regional matters. So again, it seems to me this movement on the part of China has been caused by the rapid, in a sense, development of the TPP. Okay, East Asia Summit as a game changer. I went to the White House website to find out the one sentence. This is also capturing the essence of the game changer in security. I read, White offering support for the existing East Asian agenda. Again, this is a non-traditional security agenda, it's like environment and natural disasters, etc. Well, President Obama called for a broadening of the leaders' discussions to address strategic and security challenges through the reaffirming international rules and norms in these areas. So since mid-2010, at that time, the venue was ASEAN Regional Forum, ARF. Mrs. Clinton starkly criticized China, together with Japan, on the South China Sea issues. But China, again, was said to be more interested in using bilateral talks on a settlement of the maritime disputes. This is the only way to resolve the dispute. So therefore, Americans claimed rule-based, just show the rule-based explanation why China claimed this territory. So therefore, ASEAN, well known 2002 rule of conduct, was should be more legal binding arrangement, but China has continued to resist it. So I think the importantly or symbolically EAS has been highlighted as a very in which the Americans the way of putting pressure on China. Well, of course, it's not to talk about the South China Sea dispute, but why China was so much interested in this territorial dispute, the territory in South China Sea. Well, a couple of things, but most important one probably the natural resources. Again, it's the China's resource. Therefore, I cannot check. But according to China's sources, said South China Sea region has oil reserves estimated about 23 or 30 billion barrels, covering 1/3 of its own reserves. Again, currently more than 50% of the oil actually comes from overseas. So therefore, China definitely needs the energies and oils. And importantly, South China Sea is a closest area, which is said to have a huge amount of reserves of oils. Secondly, it's more related to, it's secondary, but it's an issue which always engaged in people conflict. It's a fisheries. Again, last year, the largest 800 fishing boats actually coming into the South China Sea. And again, some of which are captured by Vietnam or Philippines. And now China also try to capture Filipino or Vietnamese boats and fishermen. This, the arrests by each other, but sort of the causing an image that, the China and ASEAN nations have been heavily engaged in loggerhead conflict or disputes. So therefore, China recently started dispatching the, again, it's a huge, the boat to protect the, Chinese fish boats, but it was transformed from the military ship, as the reporter mentioned. So it's actually source of the threat or concerns to some of the ASEAN nations. And as a result, China started claiming the whole territory as its territory, in a sense by ignoring the exclusive economic zone. But this is sort of the map borrowed from BBC. The red line was the area, covered area by China's claims. The blue line was actually indicated each claimant, the EEZ. I think this clearly indicates how the China's claims actually violate the EEZ rules. So this red line has been covered by 9 dots. Therefore, it's China's 9 dots claims. Okay, let me finally touch on the Japan's the participation in security games. Again, as I mentioned, Japan's actively engaged in the economic game in Asia Pacific, following by the Americans' interest. But there are a number of ways of gauging Japan's keenness in participating in the games on security issues, particularly. But this is just the 1 month diplomacy by Japanese leaders, with purely focusing upon issues related to security agendas in East Asia. And Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia, India, Vietnam, those are considered to be like-minded countries by United States in terms of promoting U.S. favorite rules and functions. Again, I just skip detailing what they discuss, blah blah blah. But again, it happened just 2 months, September, October, and the first time, for example, India-Japan bilateral military exercise was signed. And of course, as you know, the India also Vietnam military exercises were also rumored. So these are sort of the evidence of America's hitherto success in coalition building efforts, particularly to exercise the pressure on China. Again, of course, final answer whether the U.S. was successful or not, should be made after seeing the China's concessions. But again, from the academic viewpoint, without which we cannot provide the objective judgment. But so far, I think the movement taking place in Asia Pacific region by involving the like-minded countries has been in favor of the Americans' interests. But the point is whether China will be agreeing to have, for example, rule-based, legally binding rule of conduct with ASEANs or not, or China will be releasing the explanations based on the international rules on the territory disputes, or China is signing the, for example, investment treaty with Japan and South Korea, with under the form of so-called high qualities, rather than including a number of loopholes. So there are probably some of the variables to be used for gauging the Americans, the game change would be successful or not. So I need probably more time to use it. But final point, again, this is just the optimizing what I said here. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, we'll move on to questions. As usual, we do have people wandering around with microphones. So before when you want to ask your question, raise your hand. Before you do, please state your name and any institutional affiliation you might have. The gentleman down here.
Thank you. My name is Nguyen Anh Hong from George Mason University. I have one question for clarification. When I look at your list of meetings in 2012, I recognize that you put there will be a summit meeting in October 2012 in Vietnam. Does that mean that the United States President Obama has committed to go there? Is that correct?
Which, sorry.
Summit meeting in Vietnam, 31st October 2012.
Okay, sorry, this is Japanese, and...
so you just for Japan, okay?
Yeah, sorry,
thank
yeah.
you. Okay.
No, U.S., sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my second question is about Japan's attitude to the American game change. It appeared to me that Japan seemed to be a reluctant participant in the American games in Asia compared to other countries. For example, India, the Philippines, Australia, even South Korea. So my question is there any rationale for that? Is it different to China? And so, if so, why?
Answer? Okay. Could you just clarify the reasoning behind your assertion that Japan is reluctant to do that?
Well, for example, when the Americans were having intensive or increased cooperation in defense for American presence in Australia, in the Philippines, in Singapore, and why Japan and Americans talking about, decreasing American presence there.
Well, I think you might hint at the Japan's reluctant to solve the so-called the American-based dispute in Okinawa. Again, this is certainly considered to be a source of reluctance on the part of Japan, but on the other hand, this is so-called a part of the realignment or reconfiguration of American military strategy in Asia-Pacific, and currently nearly 40,000 of American soldiers existed in Japan, and giving a lot of support, logistic support, and even financial support, host nation support system. Japan provided, the most, and to the United States. But certainly, the Okinawa is a bit annoying issue for both Japan and the United States. But looking at the level of support, I think Japan is very committed to keeping the American presence in Asia-Pacific region. We have, of course, American bases from north to the Okinawa, 6, 7, and bases. Again, this is the only nation which provided such a wide range of the arrangements to the American soldiers. Again, as evidence, particularly after the earthquake, American soldiers, American people provided us, Japan, the huge support. And many people now realizing without the U.S. alliance system here, in Japan, this kind of the huge amount of support would not have been provided. So now the Japanese people, more than 90% of Japanese people, believe, having a friendly perception towards the American soldiers. This never happened before. Again, this was probably the basis for sustaining or maintaining the American bases in Japan. This was also the source of the America's engagement, military engagement in Asia-Pacific region. So from Japanese viewpoint, it's a bit hard to find out some of the strong evidences to say that Japan became quite reluctant to support the American engagement.
Thank you. My name is Jae-kyung Park. I'm currently doing my research at CSIS. I have to first thank you, in spite of your busy schedule. I heard tomorrow you are leaving, how stressful you are now in leaving the U.S. and congratulate you in your new career at a new university in April in Japan. Rather than a question, I feel like I have to provide you a couple of comments. First, you divided ARF EAS on one side, game 1, and EAS on other side as game 2, and the issues were on the EAS side, game 2 side, territorial disputes. It may be better be written as like maritime security or hard security issues. It can be misleading. Territorial disputes. My understanding is that no other countries than the claimant states, including China and some ASEAN member states, they are the claimant states to deal with this territorial dispute or sovereignty issues. But other states, including the U.S. and Korea, they are including Japan too. They are interested in the freedom of navigation or maritime security. And maritime security may not necessarily be directly interpreted as South China Sea issues. It can be including the piracy issues and maritime environment issues. And it's true that the U.S. First tried to streamline these multilateral institutions. On the one hand, EAS as security focused, and then the APEC as on the other side as economic focused. But later, because as you mentioned, there's ASEAN way, and this is ASEAN summit meetings, ASEAN plus meetings, even the EAS is. So the agenda settings and all the logistic preparations are being made by ASEAN side. So that U.S. initial idea has not been well accepted. So even last year's EAS summit meetings, the leaders could pick any topics of strategic interest, security, political, economic, and even cultural issues they could pick. So there has not been yet widespread consensus among the EAS member states that the hard security issues, including maritime security, should dominate the fora. And secondly, after TPP, you assessed there has been a more flexibility from the Chinese side. It's true that there's APT side, there is EAFTA, an idea of ASEAN plus 3. And then on EAS side, there's CEPIA called the ASEAN plus 6 economic integration idea. But the Chinese seems to explain that they are not closing or they are not just want to have this ASEAN plus 3 FTA. It's a matter of timings. So it's kind of sequential approach. Okay, ASEAN plus 3 practically comes first, and then finally ASEAN plus 6. I think it's not just recent approach after Japan decided to join the TPP. Rather than they have refined this kind of approach from a long time ago, and last year's EAS summit meeting in Bali in November in Indonesia last year, the ASEAN surprised all the members, all the participating countries by providing a new concept. There was an ASEAN Plus and working groups for 4 economic integration issues, and ASEAN is anyway very clever to make a new word, to coin a wordings. Previously ASEAN plus 3 and ASEAN plus 6, and what then RCEP, a new concept, has been provided. We have yet to see what that exactly means, but theoretically their explanation is that ASEAN plus any country who are interested in. So we have yet to see. So it's not just a matter of ASEAN plus 3 or ASEAN plus 6 or 8. It's just a bigger role of a bigger picture of ASEAN East Asian regional economic integration. Finally, about the South China Sea issues, you seem to explain this issue like a rule of law, rule-based approach, multilaterally or bilaterally. The reason, what I have an understanding, is that China wants to have approach this bilaterally because they think basically, fundamentally, this is an issue of bilateral concern. It's not an issue of multilateral topic. But the other countries, as I mentioned, other countries' concern is not the territorial jurisdiction. It's a matter of freedom of navigation. So it's slightly different whether we have to interpret this rule-based or just not rule-based. So the slight difference in that matter. Thank you very much.
What should I add? Well, thank you very much for clarification on some of the terminologies which I used for the PowerPoint. Yeah, you are right. And but one point probably I need to say something was related to the East Asian integration, ASEAN-centered approaches, etc. Yes, and particularly Indonesia has been very vocal in terms of the coining new words. But why China and Japan came closer? Of course, TPP was one of the factors. But another one was China really wanted to move the East Asian integration, while the United States has been utilizing the Asian-Pacific framework through the TPP. And Japan was also feeling a little bit frustrated with the ASEAN's, the reluctance to be engaged in the wider regional integration framework. And this was actually we discussed in Tokyo 2 weeks ago. And with Japanese, they raised these issues against the ASEAN people. Interested in the East Asian framework or wide regional integration beyond ASEAN or ASEAN plus one. So I think the China-Japan at least shared this concern. And just to help the ASEAN move beyond the ASEAN plus one framework, I think the China-Japan proposed and Indonesia agreed. And then they tried to, it's often the case of ARF, for example, 1994. They tried to coin the new word, borrowing some of the ideas given by other countries. So I think China and Japan should be fine with this kind of alignment. So therefore, yes, I agree in this case that, whether East Asian integration plans or ideas are going. And at the moment, I didn't know anything about, the concrete roadmap to officially commence the negotiations towards the East Asian regional integration. So probably next year, I think East Asian countries, particularly plus three nations, need to work a bit harder to work out. But in this case, China-Japan Korea's the interest in Northeast Asian regionalism was a quite significant element because it provided the motivation within ASEAN to do something new. Sorry, again, my own experience in July, Singapore actually organizing a conference in China-Japan Korea integration in Singapore, not in Northeast Asia. This probably indicates the ASEAN's concern, how the big three nations movement would affect the ASEAN's, particularly in terms of the investment.
Thank you, Bryce. Bernard Gordon, University of New Hampshire. Professor Terada, I recognize that you probably do not make an error of necessarily connecting the TPP to China. But the very fact that on the identification of the program, the South China Sea issue and TPP, can give the impression that the TPP origins are tightly connected with China. And I want to suggest to all those listening, although you probably are, as I said, not needing a potential correction, the origins of the TPP, as I'm sure you know, go well beyond and well before there was any concern with the Chinese role. Not only in connection with the very basic origins, Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile, and later on Brunei, but even more to the point when Susan Schwab, as you mentioned, in the last days of the Bush administration, her initial reason for becoming involved or having the United States become involved in the TPP was to try to kickstart, if I can use that American term, to catalyze the American involvement in East Asia. Along with that, one more point. In the conversation I've had with the USTR people, it had become very clear that the experience of arranging bilateral agreements, which had been begun by former Ambassador Robert Zellick, that the whole process of the bilateral arrangements with Singapore, with Australia, with Chile, and of course with Colombia, Peru, and then most importantly with Korea. As several of the USTR people said to me, and I'm sure they've said this to many others, the process of negotiating the Korea-U.S. arrangement, the chorus, was so extended and so difficult that, as some of the USTR people, I think, are willing to say, we cannot go through that kind of trouble and difficulty again. So that the thought that Susan Schwab had, which is now hopefully gaining momentum, was to construct a multilateral or a plurilateral agreement, which has become the TPP. But even while we cannot deny that there is a China involvement, nobody in his right mind would deny that China is in the thinking, in the strategic environment. But the point is that we must not fall into the trap of accepting what some in Beijing insist, that they continue to insist that TPP is designed to contain China. It has never been that as a goal, and we must, I think, at least from my perspective, avoid falling into the trap of accepting the notion that TPP is a China-oriented arrangement. It is what it is on its surface, a trade and much larger than traditional trade-based a set of arrangements. And that's the only caution I would express, in addition to complimenting you. And I hope you have a very good time in Kyoto at Doshisha. Okay, because I was at Kyodai.
Thank you very much, Professor Gordon. Yeah, actually, I enjoyed reading your books when I was a student, and I'm very glad to see you face to face. Again, also thank you very much for informing the quite significant issues, particularly which I can use for correcting my own potentially paper. I think what you said was probably quite in line with what I got from Japanese sources. When the new government came into Japan in 2009, and even Mr. Hatayama talking about the FTAs, but we have already at that time FTAs with most of the East Asian countries except for Korea, China. And the biggest probably issues in terms of Japanese foreign FTA policy was whether we can have an FTA with China or whether we can have an FTA with the United States. And after long discussion, Japan decided to pursue the bilateral FTA with the United States. But as you said, the United States was not interested in the bilateral FTA with Japan. So only option Japan, it's left with was actually to pursue the TPP. But at that time, Mr. Hatayama's interest was more in East Asian community idea rather than pursuing the TPP. We have never found TPP in his foreign policy speeches. But after Mr. Khan came into power, taking over his position, we can find many TPP words, but few words on East Asian community ideas. So again, I think one of the origins of Japan's pursuit of the TPP was also found in bilateral approaches on trading arrangement with the United States, but U.S. was not interested in. Probably it's maybe related to what we explained in originating from its own terrible experiences on a chorus. And so therefore, I was probably too much reading Chinese sources on TPP rather than the United States. But again, Mr. Hayashi provided to me yesterday the bulk of the information on the trade, newspapers, and etc. on U.S. So probably using your own information and also the bulk of the information given by Mr. Hayashi, I can probably provide a relatively better or correct explanation on TPP and China. Anyway, thank you very much for your information.
Eric McVaden, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. I think it was this morning's newspaper where we read about expanded U.S. military relations with Australia, even beyond what President Obama discussed last November, I think it was. I wonder what the reaction was in Japan and the ROK and ASEAN to that announcement. And let me ask you to contrast it with something that's not very likely, but what if that news had been of expanded U.S. military-to-military relations with China, more military exercises, and possibly less Chinese concern about TPP, maybe even somehow bringing China into the picture? And what would the reaction be in Japan and the ROK and ASEAN to such a development as contrasted with the one we heard this morning or read of this morning?
On the Mr. Obama's speech in Australia, yeah, actually I enjoyed looking at in my office in Tokyo. It's a live broadcast by the Australian newspaper. So what I realized listening to Mr. Obama's speech in Darwin, actually, but I think speech Canberra was more significant. So let me take on the Canberra speech. I think one of the Japanese reactions to the Mr. Obama was that, again, it's a complete misunderstanding, but I know that some of the American forces might be shifted from Japan to Australia, but I think it was quite wrong. And recently, I think last week, the U.S. and Japanese government, particularly Japanese government, announced that rotation of the American Marines, they're using Hawaii, Darwin, and the western part of the American continent, keeping the U.S. Marines in Okinawa and Guam and permanently. So I think this was simply made by adding the Australia to this U.S.-Japan marine relocation or argument. And Australia's engagement in this game change was also interesting. It already started when Mr. Kevin Rudd was in power. He was said to be pro-China statesman, as he chose China and the U.S. as the very first nation to visit, ignoring Japan. And a big debate happened in Australia, particularly people who supported the Howard government. But in 2008, and the very last few days of the Rudd administrations, Australia also launched the Defense White Paper. It had very stark views on China's modernization of military equipment and also China's ambitions. Using it, Australia decided to moderate its military equipment, also updating the particularly navies. I was a bit surprised to find it because Mr. Rudd was probably working with China to get the more economic benefits. Yes, Australia has gained much thanks to China's the absorption of the courts and etc. So I think the current Australian government has been assessing the game change in Asia Pacific. They call Asian Century White Paper, which will be announced probably a few months' time. And then we can probably judge by reading that whether Australia's interest or approaches in terms of the engagement in game change in Asia Pacific lie. So it's quite hard to answer your question at this moment because Japan, Australia, even United States, many countries involved have been undergoing a lot of changes. So what I tried to say today was just to provide a sort of the way of the angle to look at the what's going on in the Pacific. So therefore, of course, you may have a quite different viewpoints and angles to analyze what's going on here. What the second one? TPP and
whether Japan would be satisfied if there was greater U.S.-China cooperation in the military, or what would Japan?
Of course, it's not happy at all. It's not happy at all. And but the point is, it's often said in Japan that who is allied nations in East Asia? Only Korea and Japan in the North Asia. China is not. So point is, without any legal basis, which means alliance system, U.S.-Japan, for example, security treaty, how China and the United States can promote the military cooperation. If China accept American bases, for example, like China and Japan, South Korea did it. Again, that would be a big issue. But still, the security arrangement based on the Korea, the treaty, it's certainly providing us a reassurance. We can probably have a good relationship with the United States.
Over the back here, Sandy. The gentleman there with the blue shirt. Yep.
Thank you for your presentation. Yeah, obviously from your presentation, identify myself first. I'm Joseph Chen. I'm visiting scholar at the GW Seeger Center for Asian Studies. The TPP is a game changer in the Asia-Pacific region. And from your presentation, it seems to me that the Japanese government took advantage of the situation of the U.S.-China competition in East Asia region and to get some schools in the game change by attending and participating in the TPP track and also Asian track, including CJK FTA. You just mentioned a triangular free trade agreement among 3 countries and the ASEAN +3 and the ASEAN +6. And what's the recent development of the Japan's participation in the TPP negotiations? Is the Japanese government still in process with in the bilateral consultations with the United States and other TPP members? And what do you think Taiwan's participation in the TPP in the future? Because the Taiwanese government also expressed its interest in to join the TPP, to create the conditions to be part of the TPP in a future decade. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On the current status of the, I think Japan's potential participation in TPP can be said to be a bit inertia, particularly after finishing the first round of the pre-negotiation with the United States and other TPP member countries. As probably you know, the 6 nations of TPP already approved Japan's participation. The 3 nations still provide reservations, obviously, New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. And Australia and New Zealand, reason why they have a reservation was related to the agriculture protections, obviously. But the United States, again, probably most of you here know about it, much more about myself. Automobiles, this is a bit tricky issues because, in terms of tariffs, Japanese tariffs on automobiles is 0. So you can simply export an automobile to Japan. But again, the Americans' probably interest is more related to so-called non-tariff barriers, because 6% of it's only only 6%. Yes, the foreign cars occupied only 6%, and the total Japanese automobile market. So therefore, not only United States but also EU, complained why Japan is not buying the foreign cars. I think this is probably key issues, and but again, it's not hard to explain why the U.S. automobile industry is reluctant to accept Japan's participation, because it would simply help the selling U.S. automobile to Japan, not only through tariffs. Again, we have only tariff 0, but by touching on the more domestic rules, like again, I don't know in terms of the non-tariff barriers in relation to the automobile sectors in Japan. So, but at the moment, Japanese domestic politics has been more focused on the consumption tax issues, and rather than talking about TPPs. So I try to read the Japanese newspapers every day. but I know the coverage of TPP has been decreasing, particularly over the last few weeks, quite radically, and touching more on the consumption tax increase issues. I think Mr. Noda, Prime Minister, really wanted to focus on this issue and making the tax bill passed in the diet as soon as possible. So therefore, probably it would take more time for Japan to, if possible, announce its official participations. But probably sometime later this year, not soon, I guess. On Taiwan's participations in TPP, legally speaking, it should be okay as the custom territory. But of course, politically speaking, it's quite hard given the China. But if China-Taiwan FTA, if it's already became effective, including more tariff reduction products, currently I think 600 something. It's very, very small percentage of products covered by ECFA, the China-Taiwan FTA. But if China-Taiwan FTA progressed by covering the more number of the products, probably China might be reassured, okay, you can have a probably FTA first with Singapore, for example. I think Singapore is interested in FTA with Taiwan. Then, by having more bilateral approaches, there would be, I don't know, there might be an atmosphere which allowed Taiwan to more confidently say we're interested in joining TPP without paying more attention to the China's views on that. But sorry to say this, but I think the China is a quite significant element in terms of the. But if I want to ask this question, if Taiwan wanted to join TPP, what do you think China would? What kind of reaction China would make?
Well, it's hard to say, because if you put the China factors into the Taiwan's participation in the TPP, I think we need to take more factors into account. For economic reason and security and strategic reasons. Yeah.
Thank you.
Marvin Ott, Woodrow Wilson Center. You've really probably partially answered this question, but back on the TPP. First part, be a prophet. Is Japan ultimately going, in your judgment, to join the TPP? That'd be the first part. And the second part, you've matched up both economic and security issues in your games. From a macro sense, in your judgment, how important in security terms is the TPP? If the TPP proceeds, Japan joins, is this a truly important factor in altering the strategic landscape in East Asia or not?
Thank you very much. Well, let me answer the second question first. As far as I remember, a couple of the economists, pro-TPP, free trade-oriented economists, claimed the most important element, Japan's participation in TPP, is more related to security issues. That's very interesting. Economists tend to say so. That means the stability and the regional sense might be a basis for trade and investment, which could be more freely exchanged. I think this is a proper basis for the economists' claims on the security, significance of security and Japan's participation in TPP. And more specialists, defense and security specialists, they are not necessarily confidently believing the U.S. might help Japan if something happened. despite U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. Just like Mr. Nagashima, currently Prime Minister Special Advisor, former Defense Minister, Deputy Minister, or something like that. I remember he said, don't take it granted that U.S. soldiers would come to Japan if something happening, especially after the Senkaku-Daikyo dispute took place September 2010. So therefore, Ms. Clinton's insistence, the Senkaku Islands would be included in a U.S.-Japan security treaty. This was very reassurance and to these people working on defense and security issues. So therefore, if TPP worked to connect Japan and the United States economically more closely, that would probably help the U.S. gaining more rationales or incentives to defend Japan. Again, it's a very simple, the calculation. But some people say so. And my colleague, I'm still Waseda person, I believe, Mr. Shotaro Yachi, he's a visiting professor at Waseda and a former vice minister on foreign affairs. And once a month, we always gather to discuss. And he also stressed the significance of security element in a TPP. And this is, he believed, the golden weapon to connect U.S. and Japan more closely. And more than 20 years ago, Japan once considered bilateral FTA with the United States. But Japan gave up. Instead, worked more on regional integration framework, which later became APEC. But at that time, the U.S.-Japan trade situation was terrible from a Japanese viewpoint. Structure impediment initiative talks and Super 301, this kind of stuff always annoyed Japan. But this time was over. And I think it's natural for many people in the government or in academia or in business circuits to consider the U.S.-Japan economic connections. As far as the U.S. is not interested in bilateralism, I think TPP would be the only option for Japan to do it. So again, I think security and political element is very, very significant. I cannot deny it. Again, first question. Sorry, I forgot. Okay.
Great. All right, we've reached our time. Before we thank Takashi for his stimulating and engaging presentation, I'd like to remind you that he is the Wilson Center's Japan Scholar. Japan Scholar, as I said, is a program for Japanese scholars to come to the center and essentially engage in their research without the hassles of students and administration. I think Takashi would agree that it's a very attractive program. If any of you have any Japanese friends in the academic world or who you think might be otherwise likely candidates for this scholarship, please go to our website, www.wilsoncenter.org, and Google Japan Scholars Program. You should be able to find it fairly easily. I'd like to thank Sandy and Hayashi-san for heading the mics around today, and also our co-sponsors, the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, and the Program on America and the Global Economy. And I'd also like to thank Takashi for his presentation.